pregnant and thus subject to medical and therapeutic care. Now, my example of Dionysus reminds us that the theme of male pregnancy is hardly new. It is the foundation of many Western narratives, from Greek myth, the birth of Athena from the head of Zeus, to the Old Testament, Eve born from Adam's rib, to rituals of male kuvad and a sympathetic birthing in early modern literature. Plato in the Theaetetus speaks of philosophical pregnancy, in which the corporeal pregnancy of women is contrasted to the philosophical travail enabled by Socrates. 18th century molly houses or gay taverns included yearly festival nights in which men participated in acts of cross-dressing, birthing, and lying in as a form of what I call gay parturition camp. The image of male pregnancy appears in numerous medieval and early modern works by Cervantes, Boccaccio, Shakespeare, and Dryden. In such early narratives, the figure of male pregnancy rearticulates biological reproduction by positing epistemological or aesthetic creativity against female conception, gestation, and birth. In the modernist era, however, what had been a trope for aesthetic fecundity, the male author's ability to transmit his literary legacy parthenogenetically, becomes a biofuturist potentiality. At a moment when racial science and eugenics presented brave new worlds purged of defective, degenerate bodies, and where sexological discourse made visible and pathological a new set of practices and subjects, the spectacle of male pregnancy was enlisted to imagine futures written in biopolitical terms. Modernist cultural representations of the pregnant male foreground the spectacle of reproduction loosed from its putative organic site in the female body and displace it elsewhere: the test tube, the surrogate womb, the male body, and not insignificantly, the novel. I suppose we could say the poem. I see this displacement as both a queering and cripping of normative attitudes towards reproductive health and the futures that such embodiment implies. It also warps traditional narrative attitudes towards biological futurity when the family romance no longer reproduces the heterosexual family. It is in this context that I read Djuna Barnes' novel Nightwood not as a Baroque anomaly among stream of consciousness narratives of Woolf, Stein, or Faulkner, but as perhaps the representative modernist novel, insofar as it offers an inside narrative of individuals interpolated within biological and racial science. Rather than seeing the cultural logic of male pregnancy as a simple reversal of gestation from female to male body, I see it as a diaspora of sexual and gendered identities among differently abled bodies and cognitive registers. Throughout the progressive era, practical versions of eugenic theories were being applied in asylums, hospitals, and prisons, where inverts and mental defectives were sterilized, incarcerated, or euthanized in the name of racial and psychological purity, not to mention national consolidation. If eugenics imagined a future of better babies and healthy families, it also constructed a past to which those deformed and disabled bodies could now be consigned. Thus, the old world could be used to describe both the backwardness of immigrants who refused to relinquish their cultural traditions and those deemed lower and earlier on some Darwinian evolutionary scale. Modernist writers often annex their futurisms, including their linguistic innovations, to such biopolitical reforms prompted by the writings of Francis Galton, Magnus Hirschfeld, Otto Weininger, and Richard von Krafft-Ebing. These fatal alignments have made it impossible to dissever Ezra Pound's historical poetics or Gertrude Stein's theories of the bottom nature or F.T. Marinetti's post-human futurism or T.S. Eliot's anthropological interests from their intellectual pursuits of racial science and eugenics, nor were their investments strictly theoretical. Quote, "If I had my way, I would build a lethal chamber as big as the Crystal Palace with a military band playing softly and a cinematograph working brightly. Then I'd go out in the back streets and main streets and bring them in, all the sick, the halt, and the maimed. I would lead them gently, and they would smile me a weary thanks." D.H. Lawrence's fusion of commercial exhibition and gas chamber suggests that within the cultural advance guard, two futures were envisioned, one for racial others, persons with disabilities and sexual inverts, and another for Northern European heterosexual able-bodied persons. The latter were provided with utopian solutions, socialist and fascist, for a future free of what was politely called amalgamation. For the former, however, there was to be no future. They represented the past, the ill-formed, the animal that needed to be expunged for the right future to be possible. And as we'll see with respect to Nightwood, this negative future also produced a carnivalesque modernism that contests Lawrence's draconian version. And of course, Rachel Blau Duplessis has really written a wonderful book about all of these issues, so I'm, to some extent, ventriloquizing things that she's already said. In these examples, male maternity becomes a metaphor for the ways that modernism figured negative futures around the threat of non-traditional forms of reproduction. The figure of the pregnant male could be seen as a camera obscura on modernity's anxieties over violated biology and traduced nature. Dr. Schreber is the exemplar. In Freud's 1911 case study, Schreber's paranoid psychosis, as described in his Memoirs of a Neurotic, takes the form of a messianic feeling that he must redeem the world by producing a superior race of men. In order to fulfill his destiny, he must first be transformed into a woman and then become impregnated by God. Freud loved this, of course. Freud reads this fantasy as a diversion of Schreber's conflicting homosexual desires onto a transgendered scenario, but he, Freud, does not confront the maternity that is at the heart of Schreber's fantasy. In order to diagnose the vehicle of Schreber's fantasy, homosexuality as pathology, Freud must avoid the fantasy of parthenogenesis, his womb envy, that is the troubling tenor. This form of desire, and Freud's attempt to contain it within a diagnosis of perverse sexuality, becomes particularly salient at a moment when medical science is intervening in reproduction by attempting to stabilize gender and racial differences, and by monitoring reproductive processes and potential sexual partners. Within eugenic futurity, such engineering would force women to cede control of reproduction to males and thus become ancillary to the biological order. As Freud's diagnosis illustrates, Schreber's desire to redeem the world through pregnancy is what Freud said is the outburst of homosexual libido that must be returned to heterosexual conformity. The specter of male maternity would be those forms of reproductive life that cannot be figured through the progressive era's narratives of health, improvement, nor modernist aesthetics formalism of the spatial or organic text.